Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the fifth in our series of webinars. We are taking the theory of marginal gains, which is making small incremental movements in a process to give an overall significant improvement, and applying this to the world of IVF. I'm Emily Austin, Managing Director of CooperSurgical Fertility Solutions in the UK and Ireland. Just going to put my camera on. Joining us today, we're delighted to have a regular panel member of the Marginal Gains webinars, Dr. Dave Morrell. Dave has worked as a clinical embryologist since 1986, training in Manchester, where he also completed his PhD studies. He has managed several laboratories in the UK and previously served as chair of the UK Association of Clinical Embryologists, ACE, and Association of Biomedical Andrologists, ABA. Dave joined Origio in November 2011 and is now Director of Clinical Support. As a member of the Professional Education and Clinical Support team, Dave provides scientific and technical support in addition to educational activities and has specific responsibility for lab designs, clinical trials and lab assessments. Another regular panel member joining us again today is Dr. Steve Troop. With nearly 35 years experience in the field and a PhD in male infertility, Steve has risen through the ranks to have been the Scientific Director of Liverpool Women's Hospital Hewitt Fertility Centres and more recently IVI's UK centres. As well as his day-to-day operational, managerial and research responsibilities in both the NHS and private sectors, Steve has often provided advice to regulatory bodies, educators, the commercial sector and colleagues around the world. He is particularly proud to have been both the chair and president of the Association of Clinical Embryologists and a founder member of the newly formed Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists. Steve now works independently as a consultant reproductive scientist based in the UK. Joining us for the first time on our Marginal Gains webinars, a warm welcome to our very own Stacey McPherson. Stacey joined the field of clinical embryology in 2010, shortly after completing a master's degree in biological sciences at the University of Sheffield. She has worked in both the public and private sector. Stacey completed her ACE certificate and HCPC registration whilst working for the NHS at Cambridge IVF. Following on from this, Stacey joined Care Fertility, where she progressed from being clinical embryologist to deputy laboratory manager. Stacey served as webmaster for the UK Association of Clinical Embryologists, ACE, for 4 years. She joined CooperSurgical in June 2021 as clinical applications scientist for the UK and Ireland. In her new role, Stacey provides clinical support, training and education. And we're delighted to say we have a special guest joining us today. Olga Razina is joining us on the Marginal Gains webinar series today. Olga graduated in 1999 with an MSc in biology, specialising in embryology from Moscow State University. She has since worked as a clinical embryologist and gained over 20 years of experience in human IVF. Olga joined Origio Russia in 2010 to assist embryologists in the setup of their laboratories, to perform audits and to advise on the flow of different laboratory processes. Olga has a keen interest in sperm selection, vitrification of oocytes, embryos and blastocysts, as well as trophectoderm biopsy for PGT. In 2019, Olga joined CooperSurgical Fertility Companies as the embryology advisor for Russia, the Nordics and the Baltic areas. We have a few international delegates today, which is wonderful. You are most very welcome to join us from wherever you may be based around the world. However, any references that we make or questions that we cover about regulation will be based on the UK and Ireland. If you have any questions at any point, please enter them into the chat box. We'd love to get your questions, so please ask away. We will pose these questions to Dave, Steve, Stacey and Olga after the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Steve, welcome. I will now hand over to you for a quick introduction.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Emily, for asking me to take part in this, the latest in this series of Marginal Gains webinars. Just by way of introduction, for those of you perhaps that haven't been to one of these webinars before, maybe I could just remind you what marginal gains are all about. So the principle of marginal gains was first really highlighted just over maybe 10 years ago by Sir Dave Brailsford, who was the performance director for British Cycling. And as you can see from this quote, marginal gains is essentially the notion of improving every single component of a system by a tiny amount. And although the individual the individual improvements may themselves not be noticeable. When they're all added together, significant improvements can be achieved. And this is represented graphically on the slide on the screen at the moment, and as I'm sure many of you will be aware of the unprecedented success that the British cycling team has had in recent years, much of which is attributed to this sort of marginal gains approach. So what we're seeking to achieve in this series of webinars, as Emily mentioned, is to apply this marginal gains approach to the IVF lab. And in this particular webinar, we're going to concentrate on the vitrification process, which is, of course, nowadays a fundamental component of every assisted conception program. I also think it's fair to say that there are a very large number of variables that can impact on the success of a vitrification program. And indeed, this article by Don Rieger, albeit nearly 10 years old now, suggests that of the 175 laboratory factors that could influence outcome, there are some 20 that relate to cryopreservation itself. But just before handing over to Dave, I'd like to take a quick look again at some data. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. I'd like to take a quick look again at some data which I actually showed in the first of these marginal gains webinars, in the introductory webinar. And these data are taken from the HFEA's Choose a Fertility Clinic website. And they show the pregnancy rate per embryo transferred, or the implantation rate, if you like, for patients under the age of 35. So these are young patients who had frozen embryo transfer in the 70 UK centres that submitted data over that particular 3-year period. And what seems clear to me from these data is that there is a very significant difference, and in fact there is a statistical significant difference in the implantation rate between the best and the worst performing centres in terms of frozen embryo transfer in the UK. So I'd like to suggest that there may indeed be some scope for improvement in some centres' frozen embryo transfer programmes. So on this last slide here, here's just a handful of the many variables that contribute to the different outcomes that we observed in the previous slide. And what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Dave, who is going to discuss at least some of these variables in much more detail. So thank you very much indeed, and over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Steve. Joe is kindly sharing the poll results, which hopefully you can see on my screen as well. So you can see there's quite a variation in question 1 about which systems people use. And thank you for those people who have been honest and said they're not really sure what the system contains. And we'll talk about that in a bit of detail as we go through the presentation. Also, you'll see that the range of volumes used for equilibration is quite variable. So almost half of people using less than 100 microliters, and we'll talk about that in more detail too. The number of oocytes handled or processed through a single drop of equilibration solution is also quite variable. And then interestingly, 75% of you have said that you do a gradual addition of the equilibration medium for oocytes. I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it's that high, and we'll highlight why that might be useful too. And then number of oocytes and blastocysts on a device. I guess the range of those isn't too surprising, with most people putting 2 on a device for oocytes and a considerable majority putting one blastocyst on a device at a time. And then in the warming medium, again, we can see quite a range, but probably, what is that? That's 42, 52, 55% less than a mil, 38% 1 to 2 mils, and small numbers using more than that. And we'll talk about that again as we go through. So this will be a relatively quick overview of the key points when discussing vitrification and how we might think about those marginal gains and how that can contribute to getting the best possible results. Now, we're only talking about vitrification. I think we're all generally aware that vitrification has superseded slow freezing or almost entirely, not exclusively, but almost entirely. And of course, the value of vitrification is the reported higher survival and pregnancy rates, and it's associated with this very fast rate of cooling. But it doesn't mean it's risk-free. Just like slow freezing, it can go wrong. And what we want to do in the next 40 minutes or so is go through some of the bits that might go wrong and that we can avoid. Steve has mentioned a number of the factors that contribute to the outcomes of vitrification, and I've listed them again here. I'm not going to talk about the quality of gametes or embryos because that's dictated by the policy of the clinic. But what we will do is go through a number of these other elements, the cryoprotectants, the temperature, the volumes, and so on. I'm not going to go through that list now, but I'll deal with each of those quickly in turn. So let's go first to the choice of media and cryoprotective agents. And it's interesting, but not particularly surprising from my experience that 29% of you said that you weren't sure what was in the kit. And I would suggest to you that it's worth finding out. It's worth understanding what the cryoprotectants are, because they do work in slightly different ways and have slightly different properties. But what's also interesting, as I highlighted in this table, is that when you look at commercial kits, essentially the key components are very similar. The concentration of the cryoprotective agents, the CPAs, is very similar across all commercial kits. And therefore, on that basis, you would logically assume that the rate of dehydration and rehydration in the case of the warming kits must be very similar. But the small differences, and the small differences that are produced in each lab, mean that you need to optimize conditions in your own laboratory. So optimization is important. But what's also clear is that because of the almost universal characteristics of these commercial kits, there's no clear evidence in favor of a specific combination, whether it's DMSO or non-DMSO. And in fact, if we look in the literature, the big question is whether DMSO-based kits, so that would be Sage, Kitazato, Irvine, and so on, would they give you better outcomes, similar outcomes, or worse outcomes than non-DMSO kits, such as Vitrolife and Origio? And if you look through the literature, there's no clear advantage of DMSO or non-DMSO systems relative to each other. And in fact, that was endorsed recently by the practice committees of the ASRM and SRBT in their paper on best practice for vitrification. And they said that they are separate and different systems, but when done properly, both give similarly very good results. Now, there are differences, some small differences between kits. There's the different sugars, sucrose via trailose, and actually the data that's available suggests that actually this nice paper by Coelho and colleagues from 2016 reported that actually the implantation, clinical pregnancy and ongoing pregnancy rates didn't significantly differ in egg donation cycles, whether the kit contains sucrose or trehalose. And similarly, if you look at the source of protein, whether it's human serum albumin or as an alternative, hydroxypropyl cellulose, again, a couple of papers, Puyol and Parmigiani, have shown that there's no difference or clear difference between those two systems. Interestingly, the HPC, the hydroxypropyl cellulose, being more viscous, was reported to give slightly better outcomes in zona-free blastocysts, but that's one report and a limited data set. So generally, the overall message is that we can't see clear differences between kits. And that's led to the idea that we can actually use kits in combination. So this idea of universal protocols, where because of the very similar compositions, that actually you can use systems as a universal warming protocol. And Lodo Parmigiani from Bologna back in 2014 demonstrated that even for slow frozen oocytes, warming kits can be used to successfully rehydrate and recover slow frozen oocytes. So that can make lab protocols and training a little bit easier. And he went on to demonstrate this quite nicely, where he did this crossover experiment of vitrifying with either Kitazato or Sage kits, and then warming in either Kitazato or Sage kits. So these are both DMSO based. There are differences in base medium, the sugar and the protein source. And what you can see here is the results are not significantly different in any of the outcomes in terms of survival or implantation rates. So we're getting similar results if we use them in the appropriate fashion. So what do we mean by using them in the appropriate fashion? Let's look at the detail of things like temperature and volume, and we'll start with temperature. And the first thing to say about temperature is that this will normally be dictated by the kit you use. So the instructions for use that you get with your chosen kit will stipulate whether they are optimized for use, typically at room temperature or 37 degrees. And that will be at specific stages in the process. It may not be universal. Why is that important? Well, the temperature dictates the rate of ingress of the cryoprotective agents into and indeed out of the cells, and that can impact outcomes because the permeability of cell membranes to the cryoprotectant is temperature dependent. So the general rule here is make sure that you are working to the temperature stipulated by the kit, and if that means room temperature, for example, make sure you're working off a heated stage or use an ambient plate if needed. And don't leave the dishes over the light source because there can be unexpected heating from that. When we talk about temperature, what we can say with a degree of confidence is that the warming step is the most critical step in all of the processes of vitrification and warming. So this is the first transition out of liquid nitrogen into your first wash drop. And here we know, and this is from the paper by Secchi and Mazur from quite a long time ago now, that shows really nicely, this was based on mouse oocytes, but I think it's clear from other data that if you maximize the warming rate in that first transition from liquid nitrogen to warming drop, if you maximize that warming rate, that will give you the optimized outcomes. So your warming medium, that first warming drop, should always be at 37 degrees. And our recommendation is that it should always be a minimum of 0.5 ml. And that's because depending on the device you use, the warming not only warms the specimen, but warms the tip of the device. So we need to make sure that that warming rate is kept as high as possible. So 37 degrees, minimum of 0.5 ml. And that means making sure that you pre-warm everything, keep it as close to 37 at the point of use. Now that's important if you choose to reuse that first drop of warming medium, that you have to make sure it gets back to 37 degrees. Now, interestingly, if you compare our two kits, for example, Origio and Sage, the first step is at 37 degrees, and then in the Origio system, it goes down to room temperature, whereas in the Sage system, the first step, crucially, is still at 37 degrees, and then the other parts, the other steps are at 37 degrees as well. So there are slight differences between systems and kits, but that first warming step, the critical first warming step, must be at 37 degrees. What about volumes? And we think volumes are a critical part of the consideration of marginal gains. And that's because you will have heard of the impact of osmolality changes during culture. Well, if you look at the equilibration medium that we use during our vitrification process, we keep these drops at room temperature for up to 15 minutes while a sample is being equilibrated. Over 15 minutes, the rate of evaporation and the impact on osmolality of the components of the equilibration medium is quite profound, and it's volume dependent. So if you're working at 20 microliters, for example, you will have lost 25% of the mass of the drop at the point of 15 minutes equilibration, which you might well be using for expanded blastocysts, for example. And even at 100 microliters at room temperature, you lose 10%. But if you increase your equilibration volume to 300 microliters, that's almost halved to just 5%. And 500 microliters, it's down to 1.2% loss in mass. Now, we're talking about mass because that's the way that this experiment was done. But if you imagine you're losing, for example, 25% of the water, that's having a significant impact on the solutes and, more importantly, the cryoprotective agents in terms of their concentration at the end of the equilibration as opposed to at the start of the equilibration. We also need to think about volume in terms of how we load the devices. And of course, what we want to do here is have very small volumes because that will improve cooling rates. So typically, we're looking at something down around 0.1 of a microliter or even smaller. We don't want to be up at 1 microliter. And if you dispense them onto a tip like we have here, one microliter actually looks enormous. And the general advice here is that you have a thin film. The optimal volume probably depends on which device you're using. You need to be aware of the loading time, because if you have an embryo in 0.1 of a microliter and you're waiting for the equilibration of the time to end before plunging into liquid nitrogen, that's drying very, very quickly. So be careful about loading too soon before plunging because of the drying effect. Be aware also, though, that if you look at some of the advice, for example, on embryo male, there's some nice anecdotal information, at least, that if you remove too much medium at this point, it can actually make it more difficult to remove the embryo at warming. So there's a little bit of fine balance there to work out internally. Another consideration in terms of volume is how many embryos or oocytes go on a device, because of course the more you put on, potentially that has an impact on increasing the volume of the medium to hold 2 blastocysts rather than 1. And that's been shown by this paper this year from Aza and colleagues in Zygote, indicating that actually the survival rate is better if you have 1 embryo per device rather than 2, simply because you're affecting cooling and warming rates by increasing the volume around 2 embryos. And again, coming back to this same slide from Secchi and Mazur, the warming is the most critical step. If warming is the most critical step, warming rates will be impacted not only by device and volumes of medium that you load in, but also the volume of medium used in that first warming step. Hence, this recommendation that at least 0.5 ml is advisable to ensure that you maximize the warming rate in that first step. Other things we'll need to think about are things like timings. How long should we equilibrate for example, because that can cause some concerns. And the important message here, of course, is that it's stage dependent. So different size cells will need different times to fully equilibrate. The oocyte is the largest cell, so will take longer. Smaller cells are evident in day 2 and day 3 embryos. Blastocysts have smaller cells, individual cells, but there you have to compensate for the volume of fluid in the blastocele. So it's stage dependent. The ideal would be that you observe the time needed for full or at least 90% re-expansion, or you can use a median time based on that. Bear in mind, you need reduced time for collapsed blastocysts. So typically here, what you would do is dispense the oocyte or the embryo to the equilibration medium just under the surface, and then allow it to equilibrate and sink down through the medium. And again, the equilibration is time dependent. Depending on the stage, it may be as short as 5 minutes for a collapsed blastocyst, or it might be, for example, for oocytes, it might be 10 to 12 minutes. And as we picked up from the poll, most of you are now doing the gradual addition of cryoprotectants by adding equilibration solution to the oocyte in a drop of medium. But that still needs to be carefully controlled in terms of timings at each step. And then the vitrification step itself. So you've done the equilibration, you move to the vitrification solution. Here we would normally advise that you put the oocyte or embryo down at the bottom of the drop. It will float up, and then you collect it and keep moving it down until it attains neutral buoyancy. And the total time of exposure, depending on the kit you're using, will typically be around a minute, maybe a minute and a half. And that time of exposure, again, is important because here we've doubled the, typically doubled the concentration of the permeating cryoprotectants, DMSO, ethylene glycol, propanediol, and we've added in the sugar, the sucrose or trehalose typically. And then for the warming, again, timings are important. You will get the sample off the device and then take them through with this timed gradual rehydration according to the kit's instructions for use. So here we're making sure that we have a progressive dilution of cryoprotectants that allows for a controlled rehydration of the cells of the embryo, whilst allowing the cryoprotectants, the permeating cryoprotectants, to leave the cells of the embryo. And remember that in the warming and rehydration steps, the permeating cryoprotectants, unlike slow freezing systems, are not present in any of these solutions. So there's only the sugar providing an osmotic gradient for this controlled rehydration. Another conundrum that vexes people quite often is whether we should collapse blastocysts before vitrification. And the answer is maybe. If you look through the literature, there are plenty of laboratories that report really excellent results without the need to collapse the blastocysts in advance. There are a number of ways of doing the collapse, as described by Kader and colleagues back in 2009. Typically, nowadays, it will be done by a laser shot. You may do it by mechanical means, either blastocyst aspiration, assisted hatching, or micropipetting, but often a laser system. But interestingly, this meta-analysis from Boyard and colleagues from last year actually came to the conclusion that if you look at the data in the round, artificial shrinkage or artificial collapse seems to improve survival rates and clinical pregnancy rates, although the data is lacking for the ongoing outcomes of implantation rate and live birth rate. But overall, there seems to be some benefit. And again, from experience, if labs are struggling to get good outcomes with blastocyst vitrification, the artificial collapse often helps improve results. That leads us on to the issue of biopsied blastocysts. So if you're doing PGT, then the question then is, do I vitrify blastocysts that have been biopsied immediately, or do I wait for them to re-expand? And if you look through the literature, the results are a little bit conflicting. The common practice seems to be to try to vitrify fairly soon after biopsy. And the overall results seem to show that the biopsy itself does not have an impact on survival rates and so on. So the key messages in terms of biopsied embryos are certainly that you don't vitrify until you know you've successfully tubed the biopsied cells. That the biopsy itself doesn't seem to have an impact on survivability or the outcomes clinically. So the general rule is that if you have a standard system of collapsing your blastocysts before vitrification for non-biopsied embryos, then you would do exactly the same for your biopsied embryos. You would make sure they're collapsed before vitrification. So you would do that typically within half an hour of the biopsy. In terms of expanded or expanding blastocysts, if that's your typical protocol for blastocysts for non-biopsied, then we would normally recommend that you allow them to re-expand and use the same protocol. As an additional comment, zona-free blastocysts that have come out of the zona during the biopsy procedure, they can be treated exactly as the zona intact blastocysts. Do devices make a difference? Not really. The general evidence, and there isn't a huge amount, this is a 10-year-old paper by Abdel Hafez and colleagues, just looking at 3 different devices and suggesting that actually there was no clear difference between these open and closed devices. So that doesn't seem to be too critical a factor. Of course, with the major caveat that you make sure you are proficient and know how to use your device of choice in an appropriate fashion. What about storage time? Because obviously we have a lot of information over a long time period of the outcomes from slow freezing. What about for vitrification, where typically the majority of people are still using open devices? Well, interestingly, there's this paper from last year from Lee and colleagues from a very large service in China. So this is from a single clinic doing nearly 25,000 blastocyst transfers. And these data are from the first embryo transfer only in freeze-all cycles. So these are elective freeze-all cycles in nearly 25,000 cases, only for the first frozen embryo transfer performed. So it's retrospective data, so you have to take that into consideration. There are some question marks about the quality of the data, but what they've indicated is if you split the data by blastocysts that have been stored up to 3 months, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24, what they actually showed was that the longer the embryo has been in storage in their vitrified system, you actually get a decline in all of the clinical outcomes. So survival isn't affected, but implantation, pregnancy, and live birth all deteriorate over time. Now, what happens after 2 years, we don't know from this data. And I think it's important to keep this sort of data in mind, but also keep it in perspective, because it is from one clinic and it needs to be confirmed or otherwise by other centres. But it's interesting that they saw such a big effect of storage time. The other key thing, and Steve mentioned this in his introduction, was the impact of the operator and when we deem someone to be competent. And there isn't a huge amount in the data, but this paper from Desailly and colleagues from 2009 is a really interesting demonstration of using a mathematical model to decide when someone achieves proficiency in a technique, and in this case they've used it for vitrification. And this CUSUM, or cumulative summation approach, and LC CUSUM is learning curve cumulative summation, uses a mathematical model to work out at what point someone becomes proficient. So in the left-hand side of the chart is the LC CUSUM. So that's during the attainment of proficiency. And this system assumes that there's no proficiency at the outset. So it assumes you've never done a vitrification before. And the principle is that it uses this mathematical modeling, and you update with each event the data. And eventually, when you cross this dotted line, you have achieved proficiency. And during the cumulative summation, the right-hand side, if you stay below the dotted line, you are maintaining proficiency. And this is a really interesting approach. So in this paper, they used human polyspermic or 3PN zygotes with consent as the model, and then allowed people to train. Now, they used a survival rate of 60%, and you can argue whether that's appropriate. But what it demonstrates is that you can use this model really nicely to show the attainment of proficiency. Interestingly, they say as part of their summary that vitrification appeared easy to learn. I'm interested to know whether people feel that that's true. What's interesting about this is in this small amount of data, they decided that someone was proficient after 43 cases. If you look at the ESHRE logbook for accreditation as a clinical embryologist, they advise 50 cases. So they're not too far apart. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour over the elements of vitrification. If I can just summarize, we know that vitrification is effective for all stages of development. We might need to slightly tailor common protocols to optimize equilibration timings, think about gradual addition of cryoprotectants, particularly for oocytes. We might consider the merits or otherwise in our own systems of artificially collapsing blastocysts before vitrification. We know, and the poll has confirmed this, that a range of volumes are being used, often successfully during equilibration. But our general advice, because of the control of osmolality in particular, is that 300 to 500 microliters removes some of the variability that be due to the change in osmolality of equilibration medium, particularly if you're equilibrating up to 15 minutes. Bear in mind that loading volumes and numbers of oocytes and embryos per carrier can affect outcomes. We also should re-emphasize volumes and so on for that first warming step, because it bears reiterating the fact that that is the critical part of the process. And when it comes to training, we obviously need to ensure that training is appropriate, that we not only show the attainment of proficiency, but also maintenance of competence. And we can typically use our usual KPIs, but it is worth looking at the Cusen, LC Cusen paper from Desley. There are others for embryo transfer, for example, because they provide additional robust demonstration of ongoing competence. So I'll leave you with my bibliography, and I think we can then move on to some questions, hopefully.
Indeed we can. Thank you very much, Dave. That was a super presentation. Really enjoyed that. Lots of information there, and we're getting lots of questions coming in, but please do keep them coming. I'd like to invite all of the panel back to join us with their screens on and their mics off, and I think we can finish sharing the presentation now as well. Thank you.
Oh,
is that you, Dave?
Yep, stop that.
Thank you. Super. Everyone's returned. Right then, brace yourself, guys. We're going to crack on. So we've got quite a lot of questions here. We'll start with our first one. If step 1 of warming is the most critical part of the procedure, what steps can I take to make this optimal? And let's go to you, Olga. You've got a lot of experience with vitrification there. Let's hear what your thoughts on that one. Would you like me to repeat it?
No.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. No, because that's a really complicated question. As Dave already showed, this is a critical step in the whole vitrification cycle. And of course, when we talk about the warming step, first of all, as Dave already mentioned, that's volume. And the minimal volume is 0.5 milliliters, and we should really follow this guideline. Of course, we know that there are a lot of clinics who use even more, 1 milliliter, 2 milliliter, and that's up to them to decide what exactly volume they are going to use. But the theory here is that we should really maintain this temperature, 37 degrees, and we can do it only if they have a really big, a large volume in the first solution. And of course, we should be really very careful with temperature. Regarding the control of the temperature. We should really measure the temperature before we start all the procedures in the lab. We should do this temperature measurement, and we should be sure that the temperature in this drop will be 37 degrees. That's the really important thing. And remember, we do all the procedures in the workstation with the airflow on. So it means that all measurement with the temperature should be done at the same conditions. That's a quick answer, and I'm pretty sure my colleagues will add a lot of things to this.
Super. Thank you, Olga. Stacey, anything that you would like to add to that question about warming being the most critical part of the procedure?
Yeah, just to emphasize, like Olga said, to keep the temperature at 37, do what you can to validate that in-house. If you can do something like Dave mentioned, can you pre-warm the dish? Can you, if you're using a center well dish, could you put something in the outer well? Could you use a hot block? Could you do, it's something just to maintain that temperature at 37, so that when you plunge your cryo device, you can be confident that temperature is optimum for that part of the procedure, because that will really help.
Super. Thank you. Dave, I don't know if you've got anything more to add to that one. I know you spoke quite extensively about that during the presentation.
No, not really. Olga and Stacey have covered it. It's just thinking about it, preparing well in advance, and making sure you do everything to keep it as close to 37 as you can, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Got a question here about bubbles, which I think we could have probably seen this one coming. So why do I get bubbles, and how can I work with bubbles? Can I get rid of them, or do I have to work around them? Stacey, let's go to you first on that one.
Okay, so obviously we don't like to see bubbles when we plunge our device into our warming dish, because we're worried that our embryo might stick to them and float away. My understanding is that bubbles can come from the liquid nitrogen. So it's essentially being carried over into the dish, and the bubbles are the liquid nitrogen floating away, if you like. So it is a little bit of a hazard of the technique. I don't know if Dave and Olga can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you're right, Stacey. I think we assume that it's carryover on the device from the liquid nitrogen. So you're carrying small droplets of liquid nitrogen that as soon as they're warming up, they're expanding into vapor, and they produce the bubbles. It's this transition from the liquid nitrogen to the warming medium that's the tricky bit, I think. Because ideally what you want is for the liquid nitrogen to have drained away and not be carried over into the warming medium. So you've got this fine balance between allowing the liquid nitrogen to vaporize before you plunge, but still getting the fast warming rate when you do plunge. And again, I think it's a tough one to nail down completely. But I think that what I'd suggest to people who see bubbles a lot is just whether they can slow down that movement from liquid nitrogen into the first warming medium just by half a second. If you're a bit frenetic and you plunge really quickly, that might be best for warming rate, but you might see bubbles more. And it just that slightly less frenetic movement just allows the liquid nitrogen to boil off before you plunge. And remember, if there's liquid nitrogen boiling off, you've still got the sample cold before the plunging. So I don't think it will have a major impact on missing out on the fast warming rate. I don't know whether, Olga, you'd agree with that.
Totally agree. And I've got a really very interesting tips and tricks from one of the embryologists regarding these bubbles. So, and that's really regarding the speed of putting the cryo carrier from the liquid nitrogen into the first solution. So this embryologist told me, so before you do this, just stop breathing for a second and then place your carrier into the solution. In this case, you will avoid any air bubbles in your drop. Yeah, nothing else to say. Yeah.
Loving that. That's a super tip there. Got quite a few questions coming in about blastocysts. In an unusual case, can a blastocyst be revitrified immediately after warming? So I guess there's been perhaps some sort of change there, and we want to just revitrify it straight away. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I've been trying to mull it over while doing other things. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Immediately I'd feel a little bit nervous about, but I don't know why. I can't say I've ever seen any case reports or anything like that that cover that situation. My gut feeling would be that I would just leave it in culture for a while to recover a little bit and then reverse the process and vitrify it again. But I can't say that's based on anything more than a gut feeling. What we do know is that revitrifying is very successful. If we look at biopsy, for instance, if you have to rebiopsy, there is a drop-off in clinical outcomes a little bit, but whether that's the vitrification or the second biopsy isn't so clear. But they generally do pretty well if you refreeze embryos. And I think revitrification generally can be assumed to be pretty successful. I would give them a bit of breathing space between the two processes, but it's anecdotal more than anything.
Stacey, Olga, any advance on breathing space, or would you go straight back into vitrification?
Never. Same as Dave, yeah. I would suggest still place these embryos into the culture, let them to re-expand, and then vitrify again. And maybe that's a gut feeling. It means that still the embryo, we know that the movement of the cryoprotectants, it's not only through that diffusion by the special channels, and we don't know exactly the capacity of these channels, so maybe they are not going to work so quickly after these different processes. So I suggest, as Dave, place in the culture and then vitrify after some time.
Super. Anything different from you, Stacey?
No, I'd agree completely. Yeah, I would for the same reasons Olga said, I would want to be sure that full recovery has been achieved before starting that process of dehydration to revitrify. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds sensible. I think the panel are unanimous on that one. A question here. We use the full 2 mils of equilibration media for cooling embryos and will vitrify up to 5 embryos in this. If we were to move to gradual addition, how would you recommend to do this? I think that's a good question as to how we can actually get that gradual. We had this referred to in the poll, didn't we? People talking about this graduation. Stacey, have you got any thoughts on that one?
As far as I'm aware, and please feel free to chip in, Dave and Olga, I don't know of if you use the gradual method for embryos. I know it's used for eggs in different kits, and it's widely used for eggs. I'm not aware of that method being used for embryos.
Yeah, I'd go with that. I think it's much more common to use the gradual addition for oocytes because of the size of the cells. It's probably not necessary for embryos or blastocysts. You could try it for sure, but the general guidance would be that the gradual addition is that protocol's for oocytes. If the question mentioned embryos but meant oocytes, what I would suggest is that if using 2 mils, they would still follow the same general protocol, but the guiding rule really of the gradual addition is that you start with the oocyte in a given volume and you add the same volume to the holding drop. And it's typically 50 microliters or so, but you could go slightly bigger than that if you want to.
Olga, have you got any practical experience of this gradual addition?
If we talk about embryos, no, and I think this gradual addition is rather complicated procedure compared to the usual one. So I suggest we really recommend this only for oocytes, as Dave says, because of this low ratio between volume and surface area of the oocytes. And for embryos and blastocysts, that's definitely this simple protocol, just volumes, equilibration, vitrification, and that's it.
Great. Okay, thank you. I've got a question here. What is the maximum number of times that we can break the cool chain of the media in and out of the fridge when using for vitrification or thawing? Steve, I was just about to ask you if that was one you wanted to take, but then I saw your face.
No, I think I'm going to pass this on to the commercial guys. I really don't know the answers to that, I'm afraid. Dave?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's probably one of the hardest questions we'll get, to be honest, because there's not a lot of data to back it up. If I was being a bit flippant and dismissive, I'd say follow the instructions from your manufacturer, which I would say anyway. But I think it's an interesting one, and I think this will depend on the details of the technique that you're using, the volumes that you're using. So, for example, if you are using, as a number of people were, they were using less than 100 microliters in their equilibration drops. The time that, if you dispensed cold from the vial and allow the drops to warm up, then they'll be sitting around long enough for the osmolality to have already changed before you use the drop. If you're using 500 microliters, the impact of that will be much less. And then you've got to weigh that against the volume that's in the vial that you're using and opening. So you've got to weigh up the volume you're using and how many times you'll open that vial and over how long to make that judgment. So it'll depend upon the circumstances in each lab, depending on how often they'll open the vial, at what volumes they're using, and so on. What I would say is there's nothing in vitrification and warming solutions that is particularly complicated. They're generally simple media, dare I say, with a sugar and a cryoprotectant in. So if you take the vial out of the fridge and warm it up, dispense, and then put it back overnight to cool down and do the same the following day, do I think it affects the medium? Probably not, but ultimately you'll have to make that judgment yourself and base it on the protocols you're using, the volumes and frequency of accessing the vials and so on.
Thank you. So on this kind of theme, because we've got another question later on, but I think this is a good one to follow on now. Would the panel recommend following the instructions for use to the letter, or is there any flexibility here? Steve, have you got some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think it's actually it's a very real problem that lab people in labs face. So they get the kit, they open the kit, they read the instructions for use, which are of course the methodologies that are recommended by the manufacturer and have been validated by the manufacturer. So if you follow the instructions for use, then the kit should work in simple terms. But I suppose as scientists, we all understand that there is an inherent flexibility within these kits, particularly around things like the volumes of the solutions that you should use. Bearing in mind the excellent data that Dave's shown about using enough so that you don't get osmolality changes. So I think the simple answer is, yeah, you should follow the instructions for use, but the reality answer is that there probably is some flexibility in there. But I would just like to spend a minute describing a situation that I came across a couple of years ago, and people might want to think about this. And this was a clinic where they'd frozen a large batch of embryos for a patient, and then they had thawed out half of these embryos for a treatment cycle and got an extremely low survival rate. The patients then decided to take the remaining embryos to another centre who thawed those remaining embryos and got a very high survival rate. And there was then legal action taken against the first centre because it transpired that they hadn't followed the instructions for use in their thawing protocol. They deviated from them slightly. In fairness, no different to what a lot of clinics would have done, but that was deemed to be the reason legally why the why the survival rate was low. And I believe that was an out-of-court settlement involving considerable sums of money. So there are other reasons why you might want to think twice about deviating from the instructions for use. But as I say, the bottom line is that if you follow the instructions for use, the kit should work.
Great, thank you. Very good. We'll move back to more practical questions now. So we've got a question here. Should embryos be left in one position once moved into thawing solution, and when moving to subsequent solutions, or be moved gently around to promote cryomedia exchange? I like that question. Olga, what's your thoughts on that?
I like these types of questions because they are regarding this magic movement of the embryo around all these drops. There are different protocols regarding all of this, and what you should remember and keep in mind, of course, then you move your embryos from one solution to another solution. Of course, you bring another solution to the new solution, yeah, a little bit. And the idea is in vitrification, especially in vitrification solution, that you place your embryo in exact concentration of the cryoprotectant. So I suggest that, of course, you can move, and it's better to move your embryo, but it doesn't mean that you should move and create a lot of movements in the drop. So the idea is that you move just to reduce the amount of the previous solution around the embryo.
Sounds good advice. You doing anything different, Stacey?
Not really, to be honest. Yeah, I, like you say, move it over in as minimal amount as possible so that your carryover's low. And then, yeah, depending on which step you're doing, vitrifying, warming, you may want to move it around to expose it to the solution it's supposed to be in. Be gentle, and that's about it as far as I'm aware.
Great, good. And next question. As a blastocyst and indeed an oocyte shrinks when you put into vitrification solution and rises to the top of the media, should you let the embryo rise to the top and then move, or should you move immediately and not let it float at all? I'm aware the advice is to move 3 times. I'm concerned about causing damage by any manipulations that may be done at this step. So someone wanting to know whether they should let it float, or whether they should move it themselves. What do you think there, Dave?
Well, I would go back. It's a sort of follow-up question, isn't it, to the one about pipetting just now? And in the slides, what I showed is that in the equilibration, generally, what I would do is I would put the embryo underneath the surface, pipette out with a minimum amount of medium, and then let it just sink to the bottom, because as it equilibrates, it will sink. So in that case, I would just leave it alone. I would put it in the equilibration solution, leave it alone. In the vitrification solution, which is, you know, double the cryoprotectants plus the sugar, it will float away. So in that instance, I would generally use a clock face approach. So I'll put it in the drop at 12 o'clock, aspirate it back in, take it to 3 o'clock, floats up, aspirate it back in, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and then to the center of the well. So effectively what I've done is done 4 mini washes before I put it back into the center of the well. And by that point, hopefully its buoyancy is pretty neutral. So I'm doing both of the options that are in the question, but at different stages. And the reason I do it differently is that in the equilibration solution, you've got a number of minutes for it to equilibrate, and it will find its own level. In the vitrification solution, you're talking about seconds, 60 seconds or so before you need to load and plunge. So you need to sort of actively wash it into the equilibration of the vitrification solution. That would be my approach. And again, it's one approach.
It's a good question to discuss. What do you think, Olga? You may have witnessed a lot of different things, you covering a lot of different markets to us.
Yeah, people do things different, but I totally agree with Dave. Okay. Yeah, can't say anything else.
Fair enough. Stacey, any thoughts from you?
The only thought that comes to my mind is the dish type that you're using. You know, the drop shape will, I guess, influence how the embryo behaves. So if you're using a dish that's got preformed wells and it's kind of a high, so there's some height to your media droplets, then you will observe the floating. But it may not be as obvious if you're using a flatter drop. The embryo will behave in the same way, but obviously the height it can move up and down will be different. So it's just something to be aware of more than anything. Yeah.
Great, thank you. What is your opinion on thawing PN cleavage stage embryos, culturing and refreezing blastocysts?
There's actually quite a lot of data out there now on refreezing. So for freezing at the earlier stage and then doing a frozen embryo transfer where you thaw out a number of cleavage stage or pronucleate stage embryos, culture them through to blastocyst. You might do a single blastocyst transfer and choose to revitrify the others to get to blastocyst. There's quite a lot of documented evidence now that works really well. So I would suggest that's a reasonable approach.
Great, super. Anything to add, anyone? No. Okay, thank you so much. And what is the normal loading volume and what is the effect of leaving the embryo or oocyte longer in the vitrification solution? The person who's asked the question doesn't indicate how much longer, but is it a good idea to run over the recommended amount of time in vitrification solution? What do you think? Stacey, what do you think?
As Dave discussed in his presentation, the vitrification solution is where we see our highest concentration of cryoprotectants. So that's probably where the embryo is at the biggest risk of effects from toxicity from the cryoprotectants. So the way we manage that is using volumes and timings. So the timings are critical when we're vitrifying our eggs and our embryos, and that is probably more so in the vitrification solution. So our advice would always be to follow the IFU in terms of timings. With regards to the loading volume, again, follow the IFU, but as Dave said in his presentation, a thin film tends to be what we're looking for, really, because that's going to affect the cooling rate when you vitrify. So again, it's quite a critical part of the procedure.
Absolutely. Any comments from you, Olga, on that one?
I really like the question regarding the loading volume, because then we say the word volume, we mean we can measure this volume. My question is, does anybody measure this volume? You can't really say what is the loading volume, to be honest. And as Dave showed in the presentation, the minimum volume on the cryo carrier that he showed, it was 0.1 microliter. And if you again look at the publication there, people were trying to measure the cooling and warming rates regarding the volume. It says usually the volume less than 0.5 microliter. And of course, then you look at the 0.5 microliter, it's a really very big drop. So usually when we load our embryos, we make a really very tiny drop. Yeah, really, it's not a film, but just a little bit of media around the embryo. So yeah, and I think they've pointed out all of the things about stickiness, if it's a really film of media and so on. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Got a question here. Trehalose is used as a cryoprotectant by a species of frog to hibernate. Does this mean it's more effective than sucrose? Dave, I know you touched on this whole trehalose, sucrose.
Yeah, I love the trehalose question.
Yeah, it comes up quite a bit.
This is really interesting. Trehalose is a naturally occurring cryoprotectant, and it is the sugar that frogs and a number of other animals produce when they effectively hibernate at near zero temperatures. The interesting thing about the trehalose question is that in animals like the frogs, the trehalose is intracellular. So it's produced inside the cells in the animal and becomes a natural cryoprotectant. Whereas when we use trehalose as a cryoprotectant in vitrification systems, it's extracellular. It doesn't pass the membranes. So they're working slightly different ways. And actually there's some nice work done on injecting trehalose into cells prior to cryopreservation for various reasons. So it's a very effective cryoprotectant, but in vitrification systems, as far as I know, it's the primary role of trehalose is exactly the same as it is for sucrose. It's providing an osmotic gradient that allows for rehydration or dehydration, depending whether it's in the warming or the vitrification system. So it's certainly a naturally occurring cryoprotectant, but we don't use it in the same way in our vitrification and warming systems. As I mentioned, there's a few papers that suggest that trehalose offers some advantages, but in broad terms, there's no clear evidence that it makes any difference to clinical outcomes if you look at the well-constructed larger studies.
Great, thank you very much for that. Conscious that time has gone on, but we've had so many really good questions today, and I really do thank our audience for that. But I'm just going to ask you one last question just to sum up, really. What do you think is the single most important factor in the vitrification process? Olga, I'll come to you first.
Oh, I have no time to think about. Okay.
just bringing it on you.
Okay. I would say, first of all, theory of knowledge. You should know the processes regarding vitrification, but practically, I would say that's the warming step. So volume and temperature. That's the most important part of the process.
Warming temperature. Good tip to remember, I think, there. Stacey, your one thing, your one tip?
Olga's taken the warming part of the process. That was my number one answer. Just timings as well. You know, the question that we just answered. We're using really high concentrations of cryoprotectants compared to what we used to use when we were slow freezing. So it's important that we bear in mind our timings when we're vitrifying, and that we follow our IFU and we stick to those timings very carefully. Yeah.
Super, thank you. Steve, I don't know if you've got anything that you want to add to this one.
Yeah, I think we've talked in this webinar about the fact that really to have a successful vitrification program, the devil is in the detail. It's all about the timings and the volumes and the temperature and getting all of that right. So therefore, my single most important thing is training, is to ensure that the people that are doing these, practicing the vitrification techniques are doing it correctly, and that they are re-audited regularly to make sure that they're not drifting from SOPs. That would be my answer to that.
Super, thank you. And Dave, you've given us hundreds of tips, it felt like, in the presentation today. Can you narrow it down to one?
I'll give you two, if I may.
You can.
Picking up on Steve's point about training, I think it's about control and reproducibility of your processes. So if you control it really well, and everyone's doing everything exactly the same way, then hopefully it means that you're getting the best outcomes every time. And the second one is volumes, because I think the general message seems to be that if you're not careful and you reduce volumes too much, you reduce the robustness of the system. And the reverse is true. As a general rule, the larger the volumes you use, the more robust it is.
Super, thank you very much. Oh, we've got a lovely comment here saying it was a great Q&A. Well done. So thank you very much for that kind comment. And on that note, we'd better wrap up, really. I appreciate we've overrun, and thank you very much for staying with us. And thank you very much to Dave for his presentation, and to Steve, Stacey and Olga for joining us on the panel as well. Thank you very much to Danielle, who organised this webinar. She's currently enjoying a well-earned break in Spain. So we've had Joe Sheldon, who's joined us from our customer services team today as our web host master. So thank you very much to Joe. If there are any lab or theatre procedures or aspects of fertility that you would like us to cover in particular during this Marginal Gains webinar series, please do let us know. You can either contact your account manager or email us at customerserviceuk@coopersurgical.com. Our next webinar will be tackling the subject of how to do an endometrial biopsy with special guest Miss Amanda Tozer. And this will be held on October 7th between 4:30 and 5:30, so please do join us for that. If you'd like more information on this and any of the other many webinars that we run, please send an email to our customer services team at customerserviceuk@coopersurgical.com, and they will sign you up to our fortnightly bulletin where you can hear all about our events. So it just remains for me to say thank you so very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have your company. Thank you for those brilliant questions. I feel like perhaps we'll revisit vitrification again, people, because there was an awful lot there. So thank you so much. We'll see you at our next webinar. Take care. Goodbye.